hi everyone. This is Mike Shaw with the Brian Peterson School of Photography. I'm the instructor for the Star Trails and Night Photography course, and I'll be doing this week's critique of our 5 submitted images. So we're just going to jump straight into it with our first image from the Clan MacNoise graveyard in Ireland. And I'm so sorry for butchering that name. I'm sure that's not how you say it. It's a nice black and white image of this graveyard, and the exposure, so what the information we have is it's shot with an aperture of f14 and a shutter speed of a 50th of a second, exposed in aperture mode during the rain in Ireland. And so what I'm going to do in each one of these 5 images is I'll go through the image individually, and I'll offer up a few thoughts that are constructive input in terms of things that I thought might be improved for your consideration. And of course, it's entirely up to you whether you choose to implement any of them. And then I'm going to follow up with the strengths of each of the image, the features and the aspects of each image that I thought were particular strengths. All right, so to begin with, the first thing that catches your eye, at least my eye in this image, is this very prominent headstone in this graveyard, which unfortunately blends right in with the one right behind it, right just here. So easy to fix. All you have to do is to, when you're shooting, making the shot, developing the composition, just stand a little bit off to your left perhaps, or a little bit closer to this headstone, and that would cause these two to not intersect, and in fact would maintain your really nice frame of the second headstone with this first one. The other thing I thought I'd suggest in a post point of view is to just use the camera raw filter to locally increase some of the structure of the stonework within the headstones and this stone wall over here. And that's easily done with a radial filter. You can just apply a filter like this, and then you can just play with the contrast, and it's kind of a subtle effect, but by going back and forth you can really see what it's doing to the structure within this headstone. And you can do the same thing over here on the stone wall. I've got left it high. If you can go low and high, you can really see what the contrast does to the structure within the stone wall. I might actually put the radial filter something kind of like that for the stone wall. So apart from that, this image has many strengths. First of all, I like the square format in this particular case. It fits the overall composition. You have a very nice leading line from the rear of the image all the way up to the front. You have this nice balancing headstone, which balances on this third of the image with this third of the image, and you have the horizon at a good level here. You've got the little piece of the village. You can see the houses and the surrounding community. And the choice of black and white, of course, finally, is just an excellent idea in this case, because graveyards inherently are, of course, solemn, somber, quiet places, and the black and white really fits this mood well, and the gray sky and the rain. It really does come across like that. So nicely done on that. Those comments are just yours to consider, and I hope those help. Okay, so our second image is entitled Fall Meets Winter. It's by Colleen Spatafora. And Colleen shot this image from the deck of her cottage 20 minutes before a power outage that lasted over 8 hours. It was a freak snowstorm at the end of October at 4:30 in the afternoon. It's in Ontario, Canada, so this accounts for the twilight, the blue hour colors of the scene. It was a 92 millimeter lens at a 1/80th of a second shutter speed. So this is really pushing the limit of a handheld shot, as she says. So way to go on that in maintaining the detail and the focus without too much blur. The ISO is 100, and it was shot in the RAW format. So Colleen writes that she likes the color of the birch. She was happy with wanted to capture the falling snow, the ambient lighting, the snow on the railing, the color of the birch tree. Everything worked except for the falling snow, and she wanted to know if we have any suggestions about that. Okay, so let's have a look in Photoshop and see how the snow appears. First, I'll just make a quick point that we have that same issue with a merger between the birch trees, the beautiful leaves on the birch tree, and the lamp. I'm just wondering if it might be possible to put the lamp in this empty space or in this empty space simply by standing a little bit to your left or a little bit to the right. The other thing that catches my eye is the snow-covered railing. Just seems a little, especially this part of it, just seems almost like an afterthought to the image. And I don't know if there's a way to emphasize it more or to reposition things so it's just simply not there. Because it is very much a part of the overall scene, as I can see. But to your point about the falling snow, here's what's going on with this. Is you can certainly see a few of the snowflakes here and here and here, but the problem is that because the snow is moving, it's only contributing proportionately less to the image. So in other words, it has to be much brighter than the overall image in order for it to register as it normally would as if it were standing still, if that makes any sense. And unfortunately, there's not really a whole lot that can be done with this. I mean, you can try in the camera raw filter to adjust any of the contrast type adjustments, the contrast itself. You can play with that. You can see what effect this has over here. You could try the clarity adjustment. That can slightly bring this out. Or you could try the dehaze adjustment as well. Any of these will have an effect. I'm concentrating on looking over here on distinguishing the raindrops from the background. But the basic problem is that they are just simply moving, and they're very small, and they're not very bright to begin with. So a couple ways around that. You can also always use artificial light. You can pop a flash off camera to one side, and then you can generate a sequence of images with frozen snowflakes, and then you could stack those together using a star trail stacking technique to build up almost a blizzard of snowflakes. That's kind of a fun thing to try. But the other thing I'd point out is that you're using a very low ISO. So let's say that you took this to 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200 ISO. That's 5 exposure stops. You could take your shutter speed from an 80th of a second to 1/160th, 1/320th, 1/640th, 1/1200, almost over a 2,000th of a second shutter speed, and that would also really freeze these snowflakes at the same overall level of exposure. And in fact, if you then decrease the shutter speed to, let's say, 1,000th of a second, you could still freeze them and have a much brighter overall scene. So again, something to play with on that. So those are my 2 suggestions, to play around with the ISO and the shutter speed trade-offs to help freeze the snowflakes in position and brighten them up in the meantime, but then also to use artificial lighting such as an off-camera flash to one side, and then to stack the sequence of images that you might get from that way using any of the star trail stacking techniques that we talk about in my course and you can find elsewhere. So Colleen, I hope that helps in terms of a couple of ways to fix that. I love the idea of the shot, and I look forward to seeing different versions of it after you've mastered that content. All right, so the next, this beautiful image of the Aurora Borealis was submitted by Rachel Epstein, and she says this is a camera on a tripod. The shutter speed was a 20-second exposure, f2.8, ISO of 1600, focal length of 11 millimeters. The northern lights were spectacular that night, and fortunately the stars in my photo are not quite in focus. Besides correcting the focus, I'm thinking I should also decrease the shutter speed time and maybe increase the ISO to make sure I don't get star trails. Excellent, excellent points. And let me just say, Rachel, that the focus on the stars is one of the hardest things to master in night photography. And we spend a great deal of time in the course I teach learning how to master this skill. It's a fundamental skill. And there's a few different strategies and methods for doing this. And once you've mastered it, it's easy to do, and you can nail it every time. You can actually see the Big Dipper here and a few other things like that. To your point, though, about the effect of the shutter speed and the ISO in order to bring out the structure of the aurora, let's take a look at this at somewhat higher magnification. And there's a couple of cool points about this I wanted to point out. The first is that you can, of course, some of the standard night photographer's friends, which is the dehaze. Look what happens to pay attention to what's going on in the night sky as I increase the clarity down here. Look at that. That's the first step. So I'm going up and then back, up and then back. So I'm going to leave that, so let's say up. And then under this FX menu, we have the dehaze. This dehaze is really the night photographer's ally. And you can really, look what it does to the night sky and the structure of the aurora. You can really, I'm overdoing it for emphasis, but you can really play around with that and see what effect it has. But the feature I really wanted to point out was your question about the shutter speed on the overall structure of the aurora. So these bands, these vertical bands, these could be several hundreds of miles tall, believe it or not. The upper part, this purple magenta, is typically from a nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. And this yellowish greenish color is mostly from, if not completely, from oxygen gas within the atmosphere and how it stratifies, how these effects are stratified in the different layers. But the deal is that, yeah, 20 seconds as you use here is kind of on the long side for an aurora shot, because it does tend to, because the aurora is moving, this movement tends to blend out the structure. And so one way to get around that is to use a much shorter shutter speed. Now, if we go back to your exposure settings, we have some room for doing that. we have here that you used a shutter speed of 20 seconds and an ISO of 1600. So if we increase the ISO to 3200 and then 6400, no problem. I do it all the time. You can take the shutter speed from 20 down to 10 down to 5 seconds and have the exact same shot with a much sharper aurora. Often I find myself shooting at 12,800s, I think I said a moment ago. So the issue of noise in night photography is much less to be feared than is often the case. So I hope that helps in terms of, yes, I would definitely play around with that if you have the opportunity to do so. But there's so many things about this shot that I really like. I love the reflections of the aurora in the water. You have a nice new moon night, so there's no light on the foreground, and that works because you have the reflections silhouetting the foreground in the night sky. You're looking almost due north. I'm not sure what time of night it was. You have this nice little bit of tree on the right-hand side providing a nice frame to this image. You have, of course, the purple bands and the aurora, and there's a whole bunch of stuff we can do to play around with these aurora colors that we could talk about in the night photography course. But for time being, I'll just say that this is a marvelous shot, and certainly appreciate you sending that in. It's a magnificent thing to see the aurora in real time. So I'm sure that you just are very humbled by the experience every time you see it. So thanks for sending that in. Okay, our fourth shot is sent in by Arabella S. Dane. It's entitled Whale Tails. And we don't have any information about the camera or the exposure setting, but we do know that it was obtained while visiting the gray whales in Baja, California, which is a magnificent sight. Now, so in terms of constructive input for the image, it's clearly a crop from a larger image. And I'm afraid that, to my taste at least, the process of cropping has somehow taken this overall impact of this image out of context, because it is a very clearly, beautifully done image of a whale's tail as it's about to submerge. But, again, I'm meaning this in a constructive way, and there's a nice flow between the light-colored water streaming off the tail and the dark-colored water going in the dark-colored tail. That's it. I mean, we just have the whale in the image, and it doesn't quite have the overall impact of if there was something else happening, and I just can't quite put my finger on it, but to me this image doesn't quite have the overall impact that I think it might have had if we didn't have quite so tight of a crop with a focus just on this whale's tail. I think maybe exacerbating the problem maybe is that this part of the tail is, to me, kind of soft. And if we'd used, I believe again, we don't know what shutter speed was used, but if we'd used a shutter speed of, let's say, a 2,000th of a second or even a 5,000th of a second, which we could do because this is bright daylight, this would absolutely freeze the detail and the focus on this part of the whale's tail, because this to me looks a little bit soft and detracts from the overall impact. I believe we were already using a fast shutter speed because the water over here is frozen, so I'm thinking we're already at 1,000th or 2,000th of a second, so I don't know if the focus is slightly off or what aperture was used. Maybe the aperture was wide open, and maybe you could get by with a deeper, more of a mid-range aperture, f8, f11, even f16. But other than that, I mean, the exposure is very well done. There's no blown out regions. There's no underexposed regions. You can see the underneath of the whale's tail, the reflection of the water down below. So that would be my suggestion, is to maybe just give a little bit more of the overall context of the composition to help the viewer appreciate what's going on here. And then our final image is entitled Under the Bridge by Kathy Cavallaro, and it's the Roosevelt Bridge in Stuart, Florida, taken with a Nikon D700, 24 to 70 millimeter focal length lens, f2.8. The actual aperture was f16. I'm guessing this was, I'm guessing this is probably right in the middle of the focal length range. It's on a tripod, 30 seconds at an ISO of 200. Well, I have to say, Kathy, I don't really have a whole lot to add to your image. I just love it. It's beautifully done. I love this type of night photography. You could perhaps try doing this at a slightly earlier part of the night. So instead of having a pitch black sky, you have some of the blue colors of twilight. But I think the effect you're going after here is the jet black sky against this beautiful red color. So this black and red juxtaposition is part of what you're after. You've done a very nice job of getting this starburst on these lights to the aperture that you chose, and that aperture gives you this marvelous depth of field, leading all the way from the front to the back of the image. And it really, this pathway really draws you in to the image, and underneath the bridge you kind of want to know what's going on back in here. And the 30-second exposure, of course, smooths out this water, and you get these lovely reflections of the lights and the bridge lights and and everything like that. So boy, I don't know. I mean, there's a little sliver of black sky. I don't know if you could stand a little bit to one side to reproduce that over here to maintain that perfect symmetry. But other than that, beautiful, beautiful image. I love the rich colors and the textures and this nice warm colors between the yellows and the reds and the blacks. It's a real nice color palette that I find very, very pleasing. So, well, everyone, I hope those help. So they're beautiful 5 images. Everyone's got some thoughts of things that to think about in the future. But I really appreciate you sending those in, and I hope these comments help. And once again, thanks for listening to this, and you all take care. Thank you.